On the morning of May 18th, 1980, a man stood quietly on a ridge overlooking one of America's most dangerous volcanoes. Around him, the forest was eerily silent. The mountain had been restless for weeks, swelling day after day, sending warning signs that something enormous was about to happen. Scientists had evacuated the area. Rangers had closed the roads. Everyone who understood the danger was leaving. Everyone except one man. His name was Robert Landsberg, a photographer who believed that history should be witnessed, not imagined. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't trying to become a hero. He simply wanted to document one of nature's greatest spectacles through the lens of his camera. Then, at exactly 8:32 that morning, the mountain exploded. Not upward, as most people expected, outward. An entire mountainside collapsed in seconds. A blast moving faster than a hurricane tore through millions of trees, flattening everything in its path. A wall of superheated gas, ash, and rock raced across the landscape at speeds that no human could outrun. Robert understood something terrifying. He wasn't going to survive. Yet instead of dropping his camera and running in panic, he made a decision so extraordinary that, decades later, scientists, historians, and photographers still speak about it with admiration. He kept taking photographs, image after image, until the very last possible moment. Then, knowing his life was about to end, he carefully rewound the film, placed the camera inside his backpack, laid it beneath his own body, and made one final sacrifice, ensuring that the story he had witnessed would survive, even if he did not. When rescuers finally reached the site days later, they found something no one expected. The photographer was gone, but his photographs were still alive. This is the incredible true story of Robert Landsberg, the man who unknowingly captured the final images of his own life, and whose last act transformed a personal tragedy into one of the most important visual records in the history of modern volcanology. Long before social media allowed millions of people to witness disasters in real time, the world depended on a handful of courageous photographers to preserve history. Every unforgettable image from the 20th century existed because someone stood close enough to danger to press the shutter at exactly the right moment. Some photographed wars. Others documented earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, and revolutions. But few ever found themselves facing a force as sudden and unforgiving as a volcanic eruption. In the spring of 1980, the Pacific Northwest of the United States was living through weeks of growing uncertainty. Mount St. Helens, a volcano in southwestern Washington state, had been considered dormant for more than a century. Most people believed it was simply another beautiful mountain rising above endless forests and rivers. Families camped nearby during the summer. Hikers climbed its slopes. Tourists admired its snow-covered peak without giving much thought to the enormous power hidden beneath it. Then everything began to change. On March 20th, a powerful earthquake shook the mountain. It was followed by another, then another. Within days, hundreds of small earthquakes were occurring beneath the volcano every week. Scientists quickly realized that magma was forcing its way upward, creating immense pressure beneath the surface. Soon, steam explosions blasted open new vents near the summit. Ash drifted into the sky. Entire communities watched with growing concern as the once peaceful mountain transformed before their eyes. Geologists rushed into the area with sophisticated instruments, hoping to understand what was happening beneath the volcano. They measured ground movement, monitored seismic activity, and flew repeated aerial surveys. What they discovered was astonishing. The northern side of Mount St. Helens was no longer stable. Instead of rising evenly, one side of the mountain was swelling outward at an incredible rate, sometimes by several feet in a single day. The entire mountainside had become a gigantic bulge, pushed outward by unimaginable pressure building below the surface. No one knew exactly when it would fail. They only knew that eventually it would. Authorities established large exclusion zones around the volcano. Roads were closed. Residents living closest to the danger were evacuated. Scientists repeatedly warned photographers, hikers, and curious visitors that remaining nearby could become fatal with almost no warning. Most people listened. Robert Landsberg understood those warnings as well as anyone. He was not reckless. He wasn't searching for fame, nor did he believe himself invincible. Friends described him as thoughtful, patient, and deeply respectful of nature. Photography, for him, was never about collecting beautiful pictures. It was about preserving moments that would never exist again. When news spread that Mount St. Helens might produce one of the largest volcanic eruptions in modern American history, Robert felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He believed that if such an extraordinary event occurred, future generations deserved to see it through the eyes of someone who had been there. He packed his cameras, extra rolls of film, protective clothing, food, and camping supplies. He carefully chose observation points that seemed to offer both a clear view and a reasonable margin of safety. Like many others, he trusted that if conditions became too dangerous, there would still be enough time to leave. It was a reasonable assumption, one that thousands of experienced people shared. What almost no one realized was that Mount St. Helens was preparing to erupt in a way that had rarely been witnessed in recorded history. And when that moment finally arrived, the mountain would rewrite everything scientists thought they knew about volcanic eruptions. Robert Landsberg would be standing directly in its path. Long before anyone associated his name with one of America's greatest natural disasters, Robert Landsberg lived a quiet life behind the camera. He wasn't a celebrity photographer working for a famous magazine, nor was he chasing dangerous assignments around the world. Those who knew him remembered someone who genuinely loved the outdoors and believed that every landscape had a story waiting to be told. While many photographers search for dramatic human moments, Robert was equally fascinated by nature itself. Mountains, forests, rivers, and changing skies were not simply beautiful places to him. They were living histories, constantly changing in ways most people never noticed. Photography in 1980 demanded patience that is difficult to imagine today. There were no digital screens to instantly review an image. Every photograph required careful preparation. Exposure had to be calculated manually. Film rolls contained only a limited number of frames, making every press of the shutter an important decision. A photographer couldn't simply take hundreds of pictures and choose the best later. Every image represented both time and intention. Robert appreciated that discipline. Friends described him as meticulous. He often spent hours waiting for the perfect light, believing that nature rewarded those willing to observe quietly instead of rushing. That philosophy shaped the way he approached every journey. He carried multiple cameras, extra lenses, notebooks, maps, and enough supplies to remain outdoors for extended periods if necessary. Preparation was part of craft. When news reports began covering the unusual activity beneath Mount St. Helens, Robert followed every update with growing fascination. The volcano had become the center of scientific attention across the United States. Newspapers published daily reports describing earthquakes beneath the mountain. Television stations showed fresh images of steam explosions rising from the summit. Geologists explained that magma was pushing upward, deforming the northern face of the volcano by astonishing amounts every single day. To most Americans, those reports were alarming. To Robert, they represented history unfolding in real time. He understood that opportunities like this might happen only once in a lifetime. Very few photographers ever had the chance to document the awakening of a major volcano from relatively close range. If the eruption occurred as scientists expected, the resulting images could become invaluable historical records for future generations. But Robert also understood the risks. He carefully studied the official exclusion zones established by authorities. Rangers and scientists repeatedly emphasized that the danger areas were being expanded whenever necessary. Robert had no intention of ignoring those restrictions. He wanted remarkable photographs, not unnecessary danger, like many experienced outdoorsmen. He believed that respecting both nature and official warnings offered the best chance of remaining safe. Throughout April and early May, he made several trips into areas that remained legally accessible. Each visit revealed a mountain that seemed increasingly alive. New cracks appeared. Steam vents multiplied. Ash occasionally drifted across nearby valleys. Wildlife behaved strangely, with many animals abandoning habitats they had occupied for years. Even the forest seemed quieter than before, as though the landscape itself sensed something approaching. During these visits, Robert wasn't alone. Scientists, journalists, photographers, and curious observers gathered wherever authorities allowed them to watch from a safe distance. Conversations often centered around one question: when will it finally erupt? No one could answer. Some experts believed pressure might slowly release over weeks through smaller explosions. Others feared a catastrophic eruption, but admitted they had no reliable way to predict exactly when it would happen. Every morning the volcano looked dangerous. Every evening it remained standing. Days became weeks. As time passed without a major eruption, a dangerous emotion slowly replaced fear: familiarity. Many people began believing they had learned the mountain's behavior. If it hadn't erupted yesterday, perhaps it wouldn't erupt tomorrow either. Human nature has always struggled with slow-moving danger. The longer disaster delays its arrival, the easier it becomes to believe it never will. Robert was careful not to become careless. Yet even he shared one assumption with almost everyone else studying Mount St. Helens. If the mountain finally erupted, there would probably be enough warning to escape. It was a reasonable belief. Unfortunately, the mountain had completely different plans. By the middle of May 1980, Mount St. Helens had become the most closely watched volcano in the United States. Scientists worked around the clock, recording earthquakes, measuring the growing bulge on the mountain's northern flank, and trying to determine whether a catastrophic eruption was hours away or still weeks in the future. Every day brought new data. Every day raised new questions. The mountain continued to form at an astonishing pace. Instruments revealed that part of its northern face had already been pushed outward by more than 400 feet. It was an extraordinary discovery. Nothing quite like it had ever been documented in the United States. The entire side of the volcano seemed to be swelling like an overinflated balloon, held together by rock that scientists feared could fail at any moment. Yet despite the growing danger, predicting the exact timing of an eruption remained impossible. Modern volcanology was still developing. Seismic monitoring could reveal that magma was moving underground, but it could not tell researchers precisely when the mountain would finally give way. Every expert agreed that a major eruption was increasingly likely. None could point to a specific day or even a specific week. For photographers like Robert Landsberg, this uncertainty created a difficult balance. If he stayed home, he might miss one of the most important geological events in modern American history. If he arrived too early, he could spend days waiting for nothing to happen. If he arrived too late, there would be nothing left to photograph. On the evening of May 17th, Robert reviewed his equipment one final time. His cameras were cleaned and loaded with fresh rolls of film. Extra film was packed carefully to protect it from moisture and ash. Batteries, notebooks, food, water, warm clothing, and survival gear were checked with the same attention to detail that had always defined his work. Everything had its place. Nothing was left to chance. Before dawn the following morning, he began making his way toward one of the observation areas that remained outside the official restricted zone. The roads were unusually quiet. Rangers continued monitoring traffic, ensuring that no one entered the most dangerous locations. Helicopters occasionally crossed the sky, carrying scientists between observation posts. The air itself felt different. People who were there later described an atmosphere that was strangely calm. There was little wind. Birds seemed quieter than usual. Even experienced researchers admitted there was an uneasy feeling that something significant might happen soon, though no instrument confirmed that an eruption was imminent. Robert reached his chosen location and began setting up his equipment. From where he stood, Mount St. Helens dominated the horizon. Its snow-covered slopes looked almost peaceful beneath the early morning light. Nothing about the scene suggested that, within minutes, the landscape would be transformed forever. He adjusted his camera settings carefully, anticipating changing light conditions if another steam explosion occurred. Small bursts of steam had become relatively common during the previous weeks. They were impressive to photograph, but rarely dangerous from his distance. He expected another morning of waiting, perhaps another cloud of steam, perhaps another series of earthquakes. What he could never have imagined was that the volcano was no longer preparing for a typical vertical eruption. Deep beneath the mountain, enormous pressure had reached its breaking point. The entire northern side of Mount St. Helens had become unstable. At 8:32 on the morning of May 18th, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck beneath the volcano. To most people nearby, it felt like just another tremor. To the mountain, it was the final trigger. Within seconds, the largest landslide in recorded history began tearing the mountain apart, and Robert Landsberg was looking directly through his camera when it happened. At 8:32 a.m., everything changed. There was no towering column of lava shooting into the sky. No dramatic warning that gave people time to react. Instead, Mount St. Helens failed in a way almost no one expected. The magnitude 5.1 earthquake shook the already unstable northern flank of the volcano. Within seconds, an enormous section of the mountain began collapsing outward. What followed became the largest landslide ever recorded in human history. Billions of tons of rock, snow, and ice broke free almost simultaneously. Entire ridges disappeared. Forests that stood undisturbed for centuries suddenly overlooked an empty void where part of a mountain had existed only moments before. For Robert Landsberg, the scene unfolding through his viewfinder was unlike anything he or anyone else had ever witnessed. Instinctively, he pressed the shutter. Again and again. Each photograph captured another impossible moment as the mountain seemed to tear itself apart before his eyes. But the collapsing mountainside was only the beginning. The landslide acted like removing the cork from a bottle under immense pressure. The superheated gases trapped beneath the volcano exploded sideways with unimaginable force. Not upward, sideways. A horizontal blast of ash, volcanic gas, shattered rock, and temperatures reaching hundreds of degrees raced across the landscape at speeds estimated to exceed 300 miles per hour. It flattened forests as if they were fields of grass. Trees more than 100 feet tall snapped like matchsticks. Entire hills vanished beneath clouds of burning ash. Scientists would later describe the explosion as carrying the energy of hundreds of atomic bombs released almost simultaneously. No human being caught in its direct path could outrun it. Robert realized this almost immediately. Through the lens of his camera, he watched the ash cloud expand with terrifying speed. It wasn't drifting. It was charging toward him. At first, he may have believed he still had a chance. Many people would have. The human mind struggles to understand danger moving at such unimaginable velocity. Distances become meaningless. What appears miles away can arrive in moments. He lowered his camera, looked toward the surrounding terrain, calculated the impossible. There was nowhere to go, no shelter, no vehicle close enough, no path that could carry him beyond the reach of what was coming. For a brief moment, Robert stood alone in absolute silence, except for the deep, thunderous roar echoing from the collapsing mountain. Witnesses many miles away later described that sound as something beyond ordinary hearing. Some compared it to continuous explosions. Others said it resembled the earth itself being torn apart. Robert was much closer. He wasn't simply hearing history. He was standing inside it. The ash cloud continued growing larger with astonishing speed. Its front edge swallowed forests one ridge at a time. Everything it touched disappeared behind darkness. Still, Robert raised his camera once more. Instead of surrendering to panic, he continued documenting the eruption with remarkable precision, frame after frame, each click preserving seconds that would never exist again. Those final photographs were no longer simply images of a volcano. They had become the last visual diary of a man calmly facing the most powerful force nature could unleash. And somewhere between one photograph and the next, Robert Landsberg understood a heartbreaking truth. The mountain had already decided his fate. There comes a moment in every disaster when survival is no longer a matter of strength, speed, or determination. It becomes a matter of acceptance. For Robert Landsberg, that moment arrived as the expanding cloud consumed the valleys between him and Mount St. Helens. Every second made the approaching wall of ash appear larger, darker, and impossibly faster. The eruption was no longer a distant event to be photographed. It had become unstoppable. Most people imagined that someone facing certain death would panic, that they would run without direction, scream, drop everything they were carrying. But history occasionally reveals individuals capable of astonishing calm under unimaginable pressure. Robert appears to have been one of them. No one survived close enough to describe exactly what happened during his final minutes. What we know comes from the position in which rescuers later found his body, the condition of his equipment, and the photographs preserved inside his camera. Together, those silent pieces of evidence tell a remarkable story. Robert continued taking photographs for as long as he possibly could. Each image recorded the eruption growing more violent, the collapsing mountain, the expanding cloud, the transformation of an entire landscape in only a few moments. Then, at some point, he made a decision that no camera would ever capture. He stopped photographing, not because he had lost courage, but because he understood that the photographs already taken were now more valuable than the camera itself, more valuable than his backpack, more valuable than anything he still owned. They were evidence, a visual record that future generations and scientists trying to understand the eruption might never have another opportunity to obtain. With extraordinary composure, Robert removed the roll of exposed film from danger in the only way he could. He carefully rewound it inside the camera, protecting every frame he had just created. Film in 1980 was fragile. A single mistake could expose every photograph to light and destroy them forever, even under unbearable stress. He handled his equipment with the same precision that had guided him throughout his career. When the film was secure, he placed the camera inside his backpack. Then he zipped the bag closed. He knew ash, rocks, and unimaginable heat were only seconds away. He also knew the backpack alone would not survive the violence of the blast. So he made one final decision. He lay down on top of it, using his own body as a shield. It was an act that required complete awareness. He was no longer trying to save himself. He was trying to save the photographs. The blast reached him moments later. A searing mixture of volcanic gases, ash, shattered rock, and debris swept across the mountainside at tremendous speed. Temperatures were hot enough to ignite forests instantly. Trees snapped, vehicles were overturned, and entire ridges disappeared beneath layers of volcanic deposits. Everything in the path of the lateral blast was overwhelmed, including Robert. Yet even in that overwhelming force, his final decision mattered. His body absorbed part of the impact. His backpack remained beneath him. His camera stayed protected. His photograph survived. It is difficult to imagine the clarity of mind required for such an act. Most people spend their final moments fighting desperately for another chance to live. Robert spent his making sure history would not be lost with him. He could no longer stop the mountain. He could no longer change his own fate. But he could still choose what the world would remember. And that choice would transform an ordinary photographer into one of the most quietly heroic figures in the history of documentary photography. When the eruption finally ended, the landscape surrounding Mount St. Helens no longer resembled a place people had known only hours earlier. More than 200 square miles of forest had been devastated. Entire hillsides were stripped bare. Lakes were buried beneath ash and fallen trees. Rivers changed course. Roads disappeared. The force of the lateral blast had flattened millions of trees in a single direction, creating a haunting pattern that stretched across the landscape for miles. From the air, it looked as though an invisible giant had swept his hand across the mountainside, knocking everything flat. Even experienced rescue workers struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. There was almost nothing left that looked familiar. The eruption had claimed dozens of lives, including scientists, campers, loggers, photographers, and residents who had either remained inside the danger zone or were caught by the unexpected direction of the blast. Communication had been destroyed across much of the area. Telephone lines were gone. Roads were impassable. Helicopters became the only practical way to reach many of the affected locations. For several days, search and recovery teams worked under extremely dangerous conditions. The volcano remained unstable. Small explosions continued. Ash clouds still drifted through the air, reducing visibility and making breathing difficult. Every mission required careful planning. No one knew whether another major eruption might occur. As teams gradually searched the blast zone, they found evidence of the unimaginable power released that Sunday morning. Entire trucks had been tossed aside. Heavy logging equipment lay twisted beneath fallen timber. Cabins had vanished completely, leaving only scattered fragments buried beneath volcanic debris. Nature itself had been rearranged. Some victims were found quickly. Others remained missing for weeks. Among those listed as missing was photographer Robert Landsberg. His family knew where he had intended to work that morning. They also knew how dangerous the situation had become. Still, hope is difficult to abandon. As long as someone has not been found, families cling to the possibility that survival, however unlikely, remains possible. Days passed. Then came the discovery. Search crews eventually located Robert's body within the blast zone. The position in which he was found immediately drew attention. He was lying face down. His backpack was beneath him. At first, rescuers believed it was simply the position in which the force of the eruption had left him. Only later did they realize something remarkable. The backpack had not ended up beneath Robert by accident. He had placed it there himself. Carefully, deliberately, when investigators opened the pack, they discovered that the camera inside had survived, covered in ash, protected from the worst of the impact. Most importantly, the film was still intact. Those who developed the photographs soon realized they were looking at something extraordinary. Frame by frame, Robert had documented one of the most important volcanic eruptions in American history from a perspective almost no one else had ever witnessed. The photographs showed the mountain during the critical moments immediately before and as the eruption unfolded. They were not sensational images taken by chance. They were the final work of a man who understood the value of documenting history, even in the face of certain death. Scientists carefully studied every frame. Each photograph provided valuable information about the sequence of events during the eruption. Combined with geological evidence, eyewitness accounts, and seismic data, Robert's images helped researchers reconstruct exactly how the collapse of the mountain and the devastating lateral blast had unfolded. His camera had become far more than a personal possession. It had become a scientific record, a historical document, a final message left behind by someone who understood that truth can outlive tragedy. Robert Landsberg never returned home, but thanks to one extraordinary decision made during the final moments of his life, neither did his photographs disappear with him. In the days and weeks following the eruption, scientists faced an enormous challenge. Mount St. Helens had not behaved the way anyone expected. For decades, volcanologists believed that the greatest danger from an eruption would come from a vertical explosion, a towering column of ash rising into the atmosphere before material eventually fell back to Earth. But on May 18, 1980, the volcano had done something very different. It had exploded sideways. The lateral blast devastated an area far beyond what many hazard models had predicted. Entire forests had been flattened in a matter of seconds, not by flowing lava, but by an incredibly fast mixture of superheated gas, ash, and volcanic debris. Researchers immediately realized they would need to rethink many of their assumptions. Every piece of evidence mattered: seismic recordings, satellite images, aerial photographs, eyewitness testimony, geological surveys, and among the most valuable pieces of evidence were photographs Robert Landsberg had managed to preserve with his final act. When experts developed the film, they carefully examined each frame. The images showed subtle but critical changes in the volcano during the first moments of the eruption: the collapsing northern flank, the rapidly expanding cloud, the sequence in which different events unfolded. Unlike photographs taken from airplanes or distant observation points, Robert's images captured the eruption from ground level, placing scientists almost exactly where the disaster unfolded. That perspective proved invaluable. Researchers compared his photographs with seismic records accurate to the second. By matching visual changes with earthquake data, they were able to reconstruct the timeline of the eruption with remarkable precision. Each photograph became another piece of an enormous scientific puzzle. The more they studied the images, the clearer one fact became: Robert had continued photographing far longer than most people ever could have. Even as the eruption accelerated beyond anything previously witnessed in the United States, he remained focused on documenting what he saw. His calm under unimaginable pressure impressed not only photographers, but also geologists who spent their careers studying volcanic hazards. Several scientists later remarked that his photographs represented far more than artistic achievement. They were scientific observations made during moments that could never be repeated. No research team could intentionally place instruments where Robert had been standing. No experiment could recreate those exact conditions. His camera had recorded evidence that nature would never offer again. Over time, the photographs appeared in scientific publications, museum exhibits, educational documentaries, and history books discussing Mount St. Helens. Students of volcanology learned about the eruption through maps, charts, and satellite imagery. But many also encountered the story of the quiet photographer whose final decision ensured those images survived. His name gradually became part of the history of the disaster itself, not because he sought recognition, but because his actions reflected something extraordinary. In the face of overwhelming danger, he never abandoned the purpose that had brought him there. He understood that history is fragile. Moments disappear. Landscapes change. Memories fade. Photographs endure. Decades after the eruption, Robert Landsberg's images continue to remind scientists how quickly nature can transform an entire landscape, and how much knowledge can sometimes depend on the courage of a single individual carrying a camera. His photographs froze only a few moments in time, yet those few moments have continued teaching the world for more than 40 years. It is a remarkable legacy for a man who never expected anyone to remember his name. The eruption of Mount St. Helens lasted only a matter of hours. Its lessons have lasted for decades. When the ash finally settled and researchers began studying everything that had happened on May 18, 1980, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. The disaster had exposed dangerous gaps in humanity's understanding of volcanoes. For generations, most emergency planning had focused on eruptions that blasted upward into the atmosphere. Hazard zones were often designed with lava flows, falling ash, and volcanic bombs in mind. Mount St. Helens shattered those assumptions. The mountain had released most of its destructive energy sideways. Communities, scientists, photographers, and workers who believed they were at relatively safe distances suddenly found themselves directly in the path of one of the most violent lateral blasts ever recorded. The event forced volcanologists around the world to rethink how dangerous volcanoes could truly be. In laboratories across the United States, researchers spent years analyzing every measurement collected before, during, and after the eruption. They compared seismic records with aerial surveys. They studied tree fall patterns. They examined deposits of ash and volcanic rock. And once again, Robert Landsberg's photographs became part of that investigation. His images helped confirm the sequence of events during those first critical seconds after the northern flank collapsed. Instead of relying solely on theoretical models, scientists now possess visual evidence captured from the ground itself. Those photographs became reference material for future generations of volcanologists. As computer technology advanced during the following decades, researchers digitized the images, comparing them with modern simulations that reconstructed the eruption frame by frame. Again and again, Robert's photographs proved remarkably valuable. His final work continued answering scientific questions long after his own life had ended. The lessons extended far beyond Mount St. Helens. Emergency agencies responsible for monitoring volcanoes in Alaska, Hawaii, Japan, Indonesia, Italy, Iceland, New Zealand, and many other countries began incorporating the findings into new hazard assessments. Exclusion zones became more carefully planned. Monitoring systems became more sophisticated. Scientists learned to pay much closer attention to unusual ground deformation, especially when an entire side of a volcano begins swelling outward. Today, satellites measure changes in volcanic landscapes with astonishing precision. GPS instruments detect movements measured in mere millimeters. Thermal cameras reveal invisible changes in underground heat. Aircraft and drones collect information that researchers in 1980 could only dream about. Every improvement exists because previous disasters revealed what humanity did not yet understand. Mount St. Helens became one of those defining moments. The eruption transformed volcanology from a science that often reacted to disasters into one increasingly capable of anticipating them. No technology can eliminate volcanic danger. Nature will always remain unpredictable, but better knowledge gives people precious time. Time to evacuate. Time to warn communities. Time to save lives. It is impossible to know exactly how many people have survived because scientists learn from Mount St. Helens. Numbers cannot measure knowledge that quietly prevents future tragedy. But every improved evacuation plan, every updated hazard map, every warning issued earlier because researchers recognize familiar warning signs, carries part of the legacy left behind by those who experienced the eruption firsthand. Robert Landsberg never imagined his photographs would become part of that legacy. He believed he was documenting history. In the end, he helped change it. And although his camera recorded only a few final moments on one extraordinary morning in 1980, the knowledge preserved inside those images continues protecting people who will never know his name. News of the eruption spread across the United States within hours. Television stations interrupted their regular programming. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Radio broadcasters delivered constant updates as rescue operations continued around Mount St. Helens. At first, no one knew exactly how many people had been caught inside the blast zone. Communication had collapsed almost as quickly as the mountain itself. Families waited anxiously for information. Phones rang endlessly. Hope and fear existed side by side. Among those waiting were the people who loved Robert Landsberg. They knew why he had traveled to Mount St. Helens. Photography had never been just a profession or a hobby for him. It was the way he understood the world. Those closest to him also knew he respected nature deeply. He wasn't reckless. He didn't seek danger for excitement. He believed preparation, patience, and good judgment could reduce unnecessary risks. Like everyone else watching the news, they hoped the evacuation zones had protected those who remained near the volcano. As the days passed and more victims were identified, that hope slowly faded. Eventually, confirmation arrived. Robert had not survived. For any family, receiving such news is devastating. But alongside the grief came something unexpected. Investigators explained how Robert's body had been found. They described the backpack beneath him, the carefully protected camera, the intact roll of film. At first, it was almost impossible to understand. Who thinks about protecting photographs during the final moments of life? Who chooses preservation over panic? Those questions soon spread beyond his family. Professional photographers were deeply moved by the story. Many saw Robert's final actions as the purest expression of documentary photography. He had remained faithful to his purpose until the very end, not because someone ordered him to, not because fame awaited him, but because he believed moments of history deserved to be preserved. Journalists also recognized the significance of what he had done. Throughout history, photographers have often placed themselves in dangerous situations to document wars, disasters, and humanitarian crises. Many have paid the ultimate price. Yet Robert's story felt different. His final act was not simply taking one last photograph. It was making sure the photographs would survive after he could no longer protect them himself. That quiet decision transformed his camera into something far greater than a piece of equipment. It became his final message. Friends later remembered Robert as a man of remarkable patience, someone who preferred listening over speaking, someone who enjoyed long conversations about nature, science, and photography. He rarely sought attention. Ironically, it was his humility that made his story so powerful. He never intended to become famous. He simply wanted to do his work well. As museums, universities, and scientific organizations continued sharing the photographs over the following years, more people learned the name behind the camera, not through dramatic headlines, not through sensational stories, but through respect. Respect for a man who remained calm when panic would have been understandable. Respect for someone who thought about the future while facing the end of his own life. Even today, experienced photographers often speak about Robert Landsberg with quiet admiration. His story reminds them that photography is not merely about beautiful images. Sometimes it is about responsibility. Responsibility to preserve truth. Responsibility to document history honestly. Responsibility to leave behind something that continues serving others long after the photographer is gone. Few careers offer an opportunity to create a legacy that extends beyond one's lifetime. Robert never expected to leave one. Yet every person who studies the eruption of Mount St. Helens eventually encounters his photographs. And behind every one of those images stands the silent courage of the man who refused to let history disappear with him. As investigators continued reconstructing the events of May 18th, another name appeared again and again in newspaper headlines. Harry R. Truman. Unlike Robert Landsberg, Harry was not a photographer. He wasn't a scientist, a journalist, or a government official. He was an 83-year-old lodge owner who had spent decades living beside the beautiful waters of Spirit Lake, at the foot of Mount St. Helens. To Harry, the mountain wasn't a geological wonder. It was home. For more than 50 years, he had watched its snowy peak through every season. He had seen storms, harsh winters, and countless minor earthquakes. Nothing in his long life had convinced him that the volcano would one day destroy everything around it. When authorities began evacuating residents in March 1980, Harry refused to leave. Reporters asked him repeatedly if he was afraid. His answer rarely changed. He insisted the mountain knew him. He believed it would never hurt him. Those interviews quickly made him a national figure. Television crews visited his lodge. Journalists photographed him feeding his cats, smiling calmly while the rest of the country watched Mount St. Helens with growing concern. Many people admired his determination. Others believed he was simply being stubborn. Scientists pleaded with him to evacuate. Law enforcement officers returned several times, explaining that the danger was becoming increasingly serious. Harry listened politely. Then he stayed exactly where he was. His decision reflected something deeply human. When people live beside danger for many years without experiencing catastrophe, they often begin believing that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Psychologists call this the normalcy bias. The mind quietly convinces itself that because disaster has not happened before, it probably never will. Mount St. Helens had remained quiet for generations. That silence created confidence. Confidence became routine. Routine became certainty. Harry Truman was not the only person affected by that way of thinking. Many visitors returned repeatedly to observation areas. Some residents resisted evacuation orders. Even experienced outdoorsmen believed they understood the mountain better. With each passing day, the longer the eruption delayed, the easier it became to underestimate what was coming. Robert Landsberg viewed the volcano very differently. He respected its power. He followed official restrictions. He never publicly dismissed scientific warnings. Yet even Robert shared one assumption with countless others. He believed there would be enough time. Enough time to recognize the danger. Enough time to pack his equipment. Enough time to leave. Neither Harry nor Robert expected the mountain to unleash a lateral explosion, moving hundreds of miles per hour. Almost no one did. When the eruption began, Spirit Lake disappeared beneath an unimaginable avalanche of rock, ash, trees, and water. Harry's lodge vanished completely. His body was never recovered. Today, it remains beneath hundreds of feet of volcanic debris. Robert Landsberg met a different fate. His body was found. His camera survived. But both men shared something unexpected. Each became part of the story of Mount St. Helens. One because he refused to leave. The other because he stayed just long enough to preserve history. Their choices were different. Their reasons were different. Yet together, they reveal one of the most difficult truths about natural disasters. Nature does not negotiate. It does not recognize courage, experience, optimism, or familiarity. A volcano does not know who has lived beside it for 50 years. It does not care who carries a camera. When enough pressure builds beneath the earth, the mountain decides. And every human being, no matter how prepared or confident, must live with that decision. When the film from Robert Landsberg's camera was finally developed, no one expected it to become one of the most important visual records of a volcanic disaster in American history. Those responsible for processing the photographs understood immediately that they were handling something extraordinary. Each frame represented only a fraction of a second, yet together, they documented the opening moments of an eruption that would forever change the science of volcanology. The images were handled carefully. Unlike today's digital files, there were no backups, no cloud storage, no duplicate memory cards. There was only one original roll of film. If it had been damaged during development, Robert's final work would have disappeared forever. Technicians worked with exceptional care, fully aware that the photographs had survived conditions that should have destroyed them. As the negatives emerged, the story unfolded one frame at a time. The first images showed Mount St. Helens before the catastrophic collapse. Then came subtle but unmistakable changes. The mountain's northern face appeared unstable. Moments later, the landscape began transforming with astonishing speed. Each photograph revealed another step in a sequence that scientists had never before witnessed from such a close perspective. The images were not dramatic because they showed flames or rivers of lava. They were dramatic because they captured the exact moment when an ordinary mountain ceased to exist. News organizations quickly learned about the photographs. Reporters who had spent days covering the disaster now discovered another remarkable story hidden inside the tragedy. A photographer had sacrificed his own chance of survival to preserve the images. That revelation touched people far beyond the scientific community. Newspapers across the country describe Robert's final decision with deep respect. His photographs became symbols of dedication, professionalism, and extraordinary composure under impossible circumstances. Many readers found themselves asking the same question. Would I have thought to protect something meant for future generations if I knew I had only seconds left? Most admitted they probably would not. Photographers understood the significance in a different way. Every image they had ever captured represented a memory, a historical record, a truth frozen in time. Robert had protected those truths with the only shield he still possessed, his own body. Museums soon requested copies of the photographs. Universities included them in educational programs. Scientific conferences displayed the images while explaining how the eruption had unfolded. Students who had never heard Robert's voice came to know his work through those photographs. His camera had become an unexpected bridge between science and humanity. The images reminded researchers that every chart and every graph ultimately represented real people standing in real places, making real decisions. Volcanology is often viewed as a science of rocks, pressure, heat, and seismic waves. Robert's photographs restored its human face. Behind every disaster are lives interrupted, families waiting, communities forever changed, and sometimes individuals whose final actions quietly shape history. Decades later, the photographs continue appearing in documentaries about Mount St. Helens. They are reproduced in books, museums, and educational exhibits not because they are the most visually spectacular images ever taken, but because they capture something much rarer. They capture courage without words, commitment without applause, duty without expectation of recognition. Millions of people have now seen those photographs. Very few realize that every image exists because, in the final minutes of his life, one man made a calm and deliberate choice. He accepted that he could no longer save himself, but he refused to let history be lost with him. That decision transformed a simple roll of film into something no camera manufacturer could ever create. Not merely photographs. A legacy. History often remembers disasters through numbers. The number of lives lost, the number of homes destroyed, the amount of damage measured in dollars. But over time, numbers begin to lose their emotional weight. People rarely remember statistics. They remember stories. And among the many stories that emerged from the eruption of Mount St. Helens, Robert Landsbogues became one of the most enduring, not because he survived, not because he performed an impossible rescue, not because he sought recognition. His story endured because it revealed something timeless about human character. In the years following the eruption, Robert's name quietly became known among photographers throughout the United States. Photography schools discuss his final decision as an example of extraordinary professionalism. Experienced photojournalists often referred to him, when explaining that documentary photography is not simply about creating beautiful images. It is about preserving reality. Sometimes, that responsibility carries enormous personal risk. Many photographers who cover wars, hurricanes, earthquakes, and wildfires recognize something familiar in Robert's final actions. Every assignment requires constant decisions. How close is too close? When should documentation stop and survival begin? Where is the line between courage and unnecessary danger? Robert's story never offered simple answers. Instead, it reminded professionals that every situation is different and that judgment matters more than fearlessness. Scientists admired him for different reasons. To volcanologists, Robert was not merely the man behind remarkable photographs. He was someone who unintentionally contributed to scientific understanding in a way no research expedition could have planned. His photographs became part of educational lectures given to university students around the world. Future generations of geologists examined his images while learning how lateral blasts develop, how volcanic landslides evolve, and why careful observation is essential when monitoring active volcanoes. Historians viewed his legacy differently still. To them, Robert represented one of history's quiet witnesses. Throughout time, ordinary individuals have preserved extraordinary moments simply because they happened to be present when history unfolded. Many were forgotten. A few became symbols. Robert belonged to that second group. His camera transformed him from an observer into part of the historical record itself. Visitors to museums dedicated to Mount St. Helens often pause when they encounter his story. At first, They are fascinated by the photographs. Then they learn how those photographs survived. That is usually the moment the room becomes silent. People instinctively imagine themselves standing where Robert once stood. Would they have continued taking photographs? Would they have known what was coming? Would they have protected the film? There are no correct answers, only honest ones. Perhaps that is why his story continues resonating after more than 4 decades. It asks questions that every generation must answer for itself. What is worth preserving? What responsibilities do we carry toward future generations? How should we respond when history suddenly unfolds before our eyes? Technology has changed dramatically since 1980. Modern cameras can capture thousands of digital images in minutes. Satellites orbit the Earth continuously. Drones fly where people once risked their lives. Yet despite all those advances, Robert Landsberg's story has never become outdated, because his legacy was never about technology. It was about purpose. The camera was only a tool. The true legacy belonged to the person holding it. And that is why, even today, his name continues appearing whenever people speak about courage, documentary photography, and the quiet determination of someone who believed that truth deserved to survive, even if he could not. In the weeks following the eruption, Mount St. Helens looked like a place where life itself had come to an end. Photographs taken from helicopters showed a landscape that resembled another planet. Where dense evergreen forests had once stretched to the horizon, there were now endless fields of shattered trees lying in the same direction, as though an invisible force had swept across the mountainside with unimaginable power. The lakes had changed. The rivers had changed. Even the shape of the mountain itself had changed forever. The summit had lost more than 1,000 feet of elevation. An enormous horseshoe-shaped crater now faced north, exposing the violence hidden beneath what had once appeared to be a peaceful snow-covered peak. For many people, it was impossible to believe that nature could ever recover from such destruction. The blast zone looked lifeless. The ground was covered by thick layers of ash. Entire ecosystems had disappeared in a single morning. Scientists predicted that full recovery might take centuries. Some believed certain areas would never recover at all. Yet nature had its own plans. Only months after the eruption, researchers began noticing something unexpected. Tiny green shoots emerged through the gray ash. Small plants appeared where no one thought anything could survive. Seeds buried beneath the surface had escaped the intense heat. Underground roots, protected from the blast, slowly began sending new growth toward the sunlight. Animals returned even sooner than expected. Insects appeared first, then birds. Small mammals followed. Over the years, elk wandered back into the valleys. Beavers rebuilt wetlands. Fish populations slowly recovered as rivers stabilized. Scientists realized they were witnessing one of the greatest natural recovery experiments ever observed. Instead of rebuilding the forests themselves, they decided to let much of the landscape recover naturally. For decades, biologists returned again and again, documenting how life adapted after catastrophe. Every visit revealed another surprise. Nature was not simply returning. It was reinventing itself. Today, visitors driving to the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument often struggle to imagine the devastation that once covered the region. Young forests now rise where millions of trees once lay broken. Wildflowers bloom across volcanic soils. Birdsong echoes through valleys that were once silent beneath layers of ash. The mountain remains active, but life has reclaimed much of what was lost. Standing there today creates a strange feeling. The scenery is beautiful, peaceful, almost comforting. Yet beneath that beauty lies a memory of one of the most destructive volcanic eruptions in modern American history. Many visitors stop at observation points overlooking the volcano. They take photographs. They admire the landscape. Few realize they are standing in places forever connected to stories of extraordinary courage, heartbreaking loss, and remarkable resilience. Somewhere beyond those forests, Robert Landsberg took his final photographs. The exact location has become part of history. The camera he carried is gone from the mountainside. The ash has long since settled. The broken trees have slowly given way to new generations of life. But the meaning of what happened there has never disappeared. The landscape changed. The science changed. Even the mountain changed. Yet one thing remained untouched by time: The decision of a single man who believed that preserving truth mattered more than preserving himself. Every visitor who lifts a camera toward Mount St. Helens today is unknowingly continuing the same tradition Robert embraced more than 4 decades ago: to witness, to remember, and to preserve a moment before it becomes history. As the years passed, the eruption of Mount St. Helens became the subject of countless books, documentaries, and scientific studies. Researchers analyzed the volcano. Engineers examined the destruction. Historians reconstructed the timeline almost minute by minute. But those who had known Robert Landsberg remembered something different. They remembered the man. Long before his name became connected to one of America's most famous natural disasters, Robert had earned a reputation for being remarkably patient. He was not the kind of person who rushed through life. Friends recalled that he could spend hours in complete silence waiting for the perfect light to fall across a mountain or forest. To many people, photography was about pressing a button. To Robert, it was about observation. He believed that nature revealed its greatest moments only to those willing to wait. That quiet patience shaped every aspect of his work. He preferred planning over improvisation, preparation over impulse, understanding over excitement. People who worked alongside him often noticed that he rarely spoke loudly or tried to become the center of attention. He listened more than he talked. He watched more than he reacted. Perhaps that is why the story of his final minutes feels so believable to those who knew him. Nothing about his last decision seemed completely out of character. Even under unimaginable pressure, he remained methodical. Instead of allowing panic to take control, he focused on the task that had brought him there from the beginning: documenting history. Professional photographers who later studied his story often pointed out something most people overlook. Operating a film camera during an emergency required concentration, changing settings, adjusting focus, choosing exposure, composing each frame. None of those actions could be performed automatically. Robert continued making those decisions while one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in American history unfolded before him. That level of discipline cannot appear suddenly. It is built over years. Some people are surprised that Robert continued photographing after realizing the danger, but those closest to the profession understand something important. For experienced documentary photographers, the camera becomes more than a tool. It becomes a way of thinking. When extraordinary events unfold, instinct often drives them to document first, not because they ignore danger, but because recording reality has become part of who they are. Robert embodied that instinct. He did not photograph the eruption because he lacked fear. He photographed it because he understood its significance. There is an important difference. Fear and purpose can exist at the same time. History is filled with individuals who acted courageously while fully aware of the risks they faced. Courage has never meant the absence of fear. It means refusing to let fear become the only voice that matters. The evidence left behind suggests Robert reached exactly that state. He recognized the danger. He understood the outcome. Yet he still found enough clarity to preserve what he had witnessed. People often ask whether he regretted going to Mount St. Helens. No one can answer that question honestly. Only Robert knew his own thoughts. What history can say with confidence is something much simpler. He went there because he believed the event mattered. He stayed because he believed it deserved to be recorded. And in his final moments, he ensured that future generations would see exactly what he had seen. More than 40 years later, his photographs continue speaking for him. His voice was never recorded. His final thoughts were never written down. But every surviving frame reflects the same quiet message. I was here. I witnessed this. And now, so can you. History remembers many great photographers for the images they captured. Some froze the horror of war. Others documented civil rights movements, humanitarian crises, natural disasters, and moments that forever changed the course of nations. Their photographs became symbols of entire generations. Yet behind every unforgettable image stood a person who made a choice. Someone who stepped a little closer, waited a little longer, or accepted a level of risk that most people would never consider. Robert Landsberg belongs to that tradition. Not because he worked for a famous newspaper, not because his name appeared on magazine covers, but because he understood something every great documentary photographer eventually learns. History rarely announces itself in advance. The moments that define generations often last only seconds. If no one is there to witness them, they disappear forever. Throughout history, countless photographers have accepted extraordinary risks to preserve moments that later became part of our collective memory. Some crossed battlefields while bullets flew overhead. Others entered cities devastated by earthquakes or hurricanes before rescue teams had even arrived. Many documented volcanic eruptions, floods, wildfires, and famine, not because danger attracted them, but because future generations deserve to know what had truly happened. Photography, at its best, has never been about creating beautiful pictures. It has always been about preserving truth. That truth can inspire, it can educate, it can warn, and sometimes it can save lives. Robert's photographs accomplished all three. His images helped scientists better understand one of the most significant volcanic eruptions in modern American history. They educated millions of students who would later study Mount St. Helens. And indirectly, they contributed to improvements in volcanic monitoring and emergency planning that continue protecting communities today. Few photographers can claim that their work influenced both science and public safety. Robert never intended to achieve either. He simply wanted to document reality as honestly as possible. Perhaps that is why his story continues touching people decades later. It reminds us that true dedication rarely seeks recognition. The most meaningful acts are often performed quietly, without applause, without cameras pointing back at the person behind the lens. Ironically, Robert spent his life photographing others and the world around him. Very few photographs exist of him. He preferred standing behind the camera rather than in front of it. That small detail somehow feels appropriate. His legacy was never about becoming famous. It was about allowing others to see something they otherwise never could. In museums and educational exhibits, visitors often stop to admire his photographs before reading the story behind them. Many are impressed by the eruption itself. Then they discover how the film survived. Only then do they fully understand why those images exist at all. The photographs become more than historical records. They become evidence of character, evidence that professionalism can endure even under impossible circumstances, evidence that purpose can remain stronger than panic, evidence that one person's final decision can continue making a difference long after that person is gone. Robert Landsberg never described himself as a hero. Those who knew him probably would not have used that word either. He was simply a man doing the work he believed mattered. Sometimes, history quietly turns people like that into heroes anyway. More than 4 decades have passed since the morning Mount St. Helens erupted. Entire generations have grown up knowing the volcano only through documentaries, textbooks, museum exhibits, and photographs. Many visitors standing at the observation platforms today were not even born in 1980. They arrived with cameras far more advanced than anything Robert Landsberg could have imagined. Smartphones instantly capture thousands of images. Drones soar above valleys that once seemed unreachable. Satellites monitor the mountain every single day. Technology has transformed almost every aspect of photography. But one thing has not changed: the value of being present when history unfolds. Every year, thousands of people visit the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. They stand quietly overlooking the crater. Try to imagine what happened on that unforgettable Sunday morning. Park rangers explain how the mountain lost more than 1,000 feet of its summit. Scientists describe the enormous landslide. Visitors listen with fascination as they learn about the lateral blast that forever changed volcanology. And somewhere within that story, Robert Landsberg's name inevitably appears. Not because he was the most famous person there, not because he survived, but because his actions transformed a personal tragedy into something that continues helping others understand one of nature's most powerful events. His story has gradually become something larger than photography. It has become a lesson about purpose. Every person eventually faces moments when circumstances are beyond their control, moments when plans collapse, moments when fear seems impossible to overcome. Robert could not stop the eruption. He could not change the direction of the blast. He could not alter the fate waiting only seconds away. But he could still choose how to spend those final moments. That choice is what people remember. History rarely gives individuals complete control over what happens to them. It almost always leaves them with control over how they respond. That distinction has inspired countless people who have learned Robert's story over the years. Teachers use it to discuss responsibility. Photographers use it to discuss dedication. Scientists use it to explain the importance of careful observation. Families use it to talk about courage. Each person discovers a different meaning. Perhaps that is why his legacy has endured so naturally. It belongs to no single profession, no single generation, no single country. The eruption happened in the United States, but the values reflected in Robert's final actions are universal. Commitment, responsibility, calm under pressure, the willingness to preserve something valuable for people one will never meet. Those qualities speak every language. Sometimes people ask whether saving the camera was worth the sacrifice. It is an understandable question, yet perhaps it misses the deeper point. Robert did not choose between life and a camera. By the time he protected the backpack, that choice no longer existed. The eruption had already made it for him. What remained was one final opportunity to ensure that something meaningful would survive. He chose knowledge. He chose truth. He chose future generations. And because of that decision, millions of people who will never know him personally have still been touched by his life. Few of us can choose the circumstances we leave behind, but all of us can choose the legacy we leave within them. Robert Landsberg understood that better than almost anyone. There is a question that has fascinated historians, photographers, and ordinary people for decades. What was the last photograph Robert Landsberg ever took? It is a simple question, yet it carries extraordinary weight. Somewhere on that roll of film exists a final frame, the last image captured before Robert lowered his camera forever. No one can know exactly what he was thinking as he pressed the shutter one final time. Perhaps he was focused entirely on his work. Perhaps he was already aware that the eruption had become impossible to escape. Or perhaps, for one brief moment, he experienced something that only those who have stood before nature's greatest forces can truly understand. A sense of complete humility. Volcanoes have existed for millions of years. Mountains rise. Mountains collapse. Forests grow. Forests disappear. Human lives pass almost unnoticed against that immense timeline. Standing before Mount St. Helens that morning, Robert was witnessing the earth reshaping itself in real time. Few people in history have ever seen anything comparable. His photographs preserved only seconds. Yet those seconds represented one of the most dramatic geological transformations ever recorded in North America. When historians examine those images today, they often focus on what appears inside the frame, the mountain, the ash cloud, the changing landscape. But perhaps the most powerful part of every photograph is something that cannot be seen, the person standing behind the camera. Every image carries an invisible presence. Each photograph silently reminds us that someone chose to stop, to observe, and to preserve that exact moment forever. Without Robert, those seconds would exist only in written reports and scientific measurements. His photographs gave history a face. They allowed future generations to see, rather than simply imagine, what happened. That is a unique power of photography. Words explain, numbers measure, images connect. A child visiting a museum may never understand seismographs or geological terminology, but one photograph can create understanding instantly. One image can inspire curiosity that lasts a lifetime. Robert understood that long before anyone knew his name. He believed photographs were more than records. They were bridges between generations. People who have never met. People separated by decades. People connected by a single frozen moment. His final roll of film became exactly that. A bridge stretching from May 18, 1980, to every person who has viewed those images since. Perhaps the most remarkable detail is not that the photograph survived. It is that Robert realized they might not. His decision to rewind the film, protect the camera, and shield it with his own body tells us something profound. He understood that history can disappear. Evidence can be lost. Truth can vanish if no one protects it. That lesson reaches far beyond photography. Every generation inherits stories because someone before them chose to preserve them. Letters survive because someone kept them. Maps survive because someone stored them. Diaries survive because someone refused to throw them away. Photographs survive because someone valued them enough to protect them. Robert's final act belongs to that long tradition. He became a guardian of memory during the final moments of his own life, and in doing so, he reminded the world of something we often forget. Some legacies are not measured by how long we live. They are measured by what we choose to leave behind. His final photograph was never meant to become famous. Neither was its photographer. Yet together, they became immortal. Every year, people travel from across the United States and from around the world to stand before Mount St. Helens. Some come because they love volcanoes. Others come because they remember watching the eruption unfold on television decades ago. Many arrive simply because they have heard that the mountain tells an extraordinary story. As they drive through the winding roads of the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument, they pass forests that appear peaceful, healthy, and full of life. Towering evergreens sway gently in the wind. Wildflowers cover open meadows during the warmer months. Birds nest in trees that did not even exist when the volcano erupted. To someone visiting for the first time, it is difficult to imagine that this beautiful landscape was once covered by ash, shattered timber, and silence. The mountain itself looks almost serene. Snow often blankets its upper slopes. Clouds drift lazily around its summit. Only the enormous horseshoe-shaped crater hints at the unimaginable violence that reshaped it forever. Park visitors often stop at the Johnston Ridge Observatory, where displays explain the events of May 18, 1980. Large maps illustrate the path of the lateral blast. Photographs show entire forests flattened in seconds. Recovered objects from the disaster remind visitors that this was not simply a geological event. It was a human tragedy. Among those stories, Robert Landsberg's quietly stands apart. Unlike many famous historical figures, there are no dramatic speeches attributed to him, no final interview, no diary describing his thoughts. His story survives because of actions rather than words. Visitors often pause longest when they learn how his camera survived. Many instinctively picture the scene in their minds. A lone photographer, a rapidly approaching wall of ash, a backpack placed carefully beneath his body. It feels almost impossible. Yet it happened. Parents frequently use Robert's story to explain courage to their children. Teachers bring students here to show that history is not only shaped by presidents, generals, or scientists. Sometimes it is shaped by ordinary people who quietly choose to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. Photographers visiting the mountain often carry their cameras with a different sense of purpose after hearing his story. They realize that every photograph has the potential to become more than a beautiful image. It can become evidence, memory, history. Many professionals have admitted that learning about Robert changed the way they think about their own work, not because they hope to face danger, but because they better understand the responsibility that comes with documenting the world honestly. His legacy has also inspired conversations far beyond photography. Emergency responders speak about calm under pressure. Scientists speak about dedication to knowledge. Historians speak about preserving truth. Each profession finds something different within the same story. Perhaps that is why Robert's legacy has endured so naturally. It belongs to everyone. The mountain continues changing. New vegetation grows every year. Snow falls each winter. Small volcanic eruptions still remind scientists that Mount St. Helens remains active. Nature never truly stops. Neither does history. Every generation discovers a story of Robert Landsberg in its own way. Some see a photographer. Some see a scientist at heart. Some simply see a man who refused to let an important moment disappear forever. And maybe that is the greatest tribute anyone could receive. Not to be remembered because of the way they died, but because of the values they demonstrated while they were still alive. More than 40 years have passed since Robert pressed the shutter for the final time. Yet every person who learns a story becomes another witness to the legacy he fought so quietly to preserve. His camera eventually stopped recording. His story never did. History has an unusual way of deciding who will be remembered. Some names fill textbooks because they led nations or won wars. Others become famous through inventions, discoveries, or extraordinary achievements. Then there are people like Robert Landsberg, a man who never expected the world to know his name. A man who never sought recognition, yet whose final decision quietly earned him a place in history. When people first hear his story, they often focus on the tragedy: a photographer, a volcano, A life cut short in an instant. But if that were all there was to remember, Robert's story would have faded long ago, becoming little more than another sad footnote in the history of Mount St. Helens. Instead, it continues to move people because it reveals something far greater than tragedy. It reveals purpose. Every generation inherits knowledge from people they will never meet, medical discoveries, scientific observations, historical records, ancient manuscripts, maps, photographs. None of these survive by accident. Someone chooses to preserve them. Someone believes they matter enough to protect. That invisible chain stretches across centuries. A historian protects old documents so future generations can understand the past. An archaeologist carefully uncovers objects buried for thousands of years. A librarian preserves fragile books that would otherwise disappear. A photographer freezes moments that time would eventually erase. Each person becomes a guardian of memory. Robert Landsberg joined that tradition in the final minutes of his life. He understood something profound. Human lives are temporary. Truth does not have to be. His decision reminds us that legacy is rarely built through grand gestures. More often, it is created through quiet choices made when no one is watching. The choice to remain honest. The choice to finish the work we began. The choice to protect something valuable, even when there is no personal reward. Those choices often seem insignificant in the moment. Only later do they reveal their true importance. Today, millions of photographs are taken every single hour. Most will be forgotten almost immediately. They capture vacations, meals, celebrations, ordinary afternoons, and passing moments. There is nothing wrong with that. Photography has always been about preserving life. But every once in a while, a single image becomes something more. It becomes history itself. Robert's photographs crossed that invisible line, not because they were technically perfect, not because they won awards, but because they captured a moment the world desperately needed to understand. Perhaps that is why his story still resonates so deeply. It reminds us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary purpose, that meaningful lives are not measured only by their length, but by the value they leave behind for others. Robert Landsberg did not stop a volcano. He did not save a town. He did not change the course of the eruption. Yet through one calm, deliberate decision, he ensured that future generations would never have to imagine what happened that morning. They could see it. And sometimes, helping the world see the truth is one of the greatest legacies a person can leave. There's an old saying among historians that every generation inherits two responsibilities: to learn the truth about the past and to preserve it for the future. Most of us fulfill that responsibility in small ways. We save family photographs. We tell stories about our grandparents. We protect letters, journals, and memories that would otherwise disappear with time. Robert Landsberg fulfilled that responsibility under circumstances almost impossible to imagine. He had only moments left, yet he still thought about tomorrow. That decision continues echoing far beyond Mount St. Helens. Today, every volcanologist who studies the eruption begins with evidence gathered by people who were there. Every documentary about May 18, 1980 depends on photographs, scientific observations, survivor accounts, and physical evidence preserved by countless individuals. Knowledge is never created by one person alone. It is built piece by piece, each contribution becoming part of something larger. Robert's photographs became one of those pieces. Without them, scientists would still understand the eruption, but they would understand it a little less completely. A few missing seconds may seem insignificant until those seconds contain history. His story also reminds us that courage often looks different from what we imagine. Movies usually portray courage as dramatic action, running into danger, rescuing strangers, making heroic speeches. Real courage is often much quieter. Sometimes it is simply remaining faithful to your purpose when fear has every reason to take control. Robert never fought the volcano. He never believed he could. Instead, he remained committed to the work that had brought him there from the very beginning. That quiet commitment is precisely what continues inspiring people today. Photographers who visit Mount St. Helens often describe an unexpected feeling as they raise their cameras toward the crater. They know someone once stood nearby with the same intention: to preserve a moment, to record reality honestly, to leave behind something meaningful. Scientists experience something similar. Each new generation of researchers benefits from discoveries made by those who came before. Every improved warning system, every evacuation protocol, every hazard map exists because someone carefully documented what happened during previous disasters. Knowledge grows through memory. Memory survives through preservation. Preservation depends on people willing to recognize that today's ordinary moment may become tomorrow's priceless record. Robert understood that instinctively. He did not know his photographs would appear in museums. He did not know students would study them decades later. He certainly never imagined that people around the world would continue speaking his name more than 40 years after his death. He simply believed the truth mattered. That belief proved stronger than fear. Standing before Mount St. Helens today, it is easy to admire the beauty of the landscape. It is much harder to remember the decisions made there by ordinary people. Robert Landsberg was one of those ordinary people. He had no extraordinary title, no political influence, no scientific authority, only a camera, and a quiet determination to use it well. History has a remarkable way of honoring people like that. Not immediately, sometimes not even during their own lifetime, but eventually, their choices become impossible to ignore. Because while mountains continue changing and forests continue growing, the value of truth never fades. Neither does the legacy of those who chose to protect it. On the morning of May 18, 1980, Robert Landsberg left home carrying a camera, a few rolls of film, and the hope of documenting an extraordinary event. He never expected that journey to become his final one. Like so many people throughout history, he believed he was simply doing his job. He could not have known that, decades later, millions of people would still be telling his story. History often celebrates those who change the world through power, through wealth, through influence. But every so often, it reminds us that the greatest impact can come from something much quieter. A single decision, made in a single moment, by a single ordinary person. Robert never commanded armies. He never led scientific expeditions. He never held public office. He carried a camera, and in the final moments of his life, he used it exactly as he always had, with patience, purpose, and respect for the truth. That is why his story continues to matter, not because tragedy is unforgettable, but because integrity is. When the eruption ended, the mountain had changed forever. Its summit was gone. Entire forests had vanished. Dozens of lives had been lost. The landscape would never look the same again. Yet amid all that destruction, one small backpack survived. Inside it rested a camera. Inside that camera rested a roll of film. And inside that film rested a gift from one generation to the next, the chance to witness history exactly as it unfolded. Every time those photographs are displayed in a museum, every time a student studies the eruption, every time a documentary shows the first moments of Mount St. Helens collapsing, Robert is still fulfilling the purpose that brought him there. His work never ended. It simply found new audiences. There's something deeply moving about that idea. Most of us hope to leave something meaningful behind. A family, a lesson, a memory, a piece of work that continues helping others after we are gone. Robert accomplished that without ever knowing he had. His legacy was not built through fame. It was built through character. Character revealed only when everything else had been stripped away. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within this story. We cannot always choose the events that shape our lives. We cannot control earthquakes, storms, wars, or volcanoes, but we can always choose how we respond. Sometimes those choices affect only ourselves. Sometimes they affect generations yet to come. Robert Landsberg never lived to see the impact of his final decision. He never watched scientists learn from his photographs. He never heard visitors quietly speak his name while standing before Mount St. Helens. He never knew that aspiring photographers would one day look to him as an example of quiet dedication. Yet all those things happened because, in the face of overwhelming fear, he refused to abandon what he believed mattered. His camera eventually stopped recording. His heartbeat eventually stopped as well, but his purpose did not. It continued inside every photograph that survived beneath him. More than 40 years later, those images remain exactly what Robert hoped they would become, a truthful record of history. And perhaps that is the most remarkable ending of all. The volcano took his life, but it could not erase his story, because truth, once preserved with courage, has a way of outliving even the mountains themselves. If you visit Mount St. Helens today, it is surprisingly easy to forget what happened there. The roads are well maintained. The visitor centers welcome thousands of people every year. Children laugh as they look through binoculars toward the crater. Families take photographs against one of the most beautiful mountain landscapes in the Pacific Northwest. Life has returned. The forests are green once again. Wildflowers bloom across the volcanic soil. Elk wander through valleys that were once buried beneath ash. Nature has done what it has always done. It has healed. But beneath that peaceful landscape lies a silent reminder of how quickly everything can change. The mountain does not announce when it will rewrite history. It simply waits. Then, in a matter of moments, the world becomes different. Perhaps that is why Robert Landsberg's story continues to resonate so deeply. It is not really a story about a volcano, nor is it only a story about photography. It is a story about how ordinary people respond when confronted with extraordinary moments. Every one of us hopes we will make the right decision when life suddenly places us in circumstances we never expected. None of us truly knows until that moment arrives. Robert never planned to become an example of courage. He never woke up that morning believing history would remember him. He simply remained faithful to the values that had guided him throughout his life. Respect the truth. Document reality honestly. Leave something meaningful behind. In a world where attention is often measured in seconds and headlines disappear almost as quickly as they appear, his story reminds us that some actions never lose their value. Technology will continue changing. Cameras will become smaller. Images will become sharper. Artificial intelligence may one day recreate scenes with astonishing realism, but no technology can replace authenticity. No computer can recreate the quiet determination of a person standing before history as it unfolds. That is why Robert's photographs still matter. Not because they are the highest resolution, not because they're the most dramatic, but because they are real. Every grain of film represents a moment that truly happened. Every frame carries the weight of decision made by a man who understood that some moments belong not only to those who witnessed them, but to everyone who comes after. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within his story. We rarely know which ordinary day will become the one people remember. We rarely realize that small decisions made today may continue affecting lives decades from now. Legacy is almost never created intentionally. It is created through consistency, through character, through choosing, again and again, to do what is right even when no one is watching. Robert Landsberg did exactly that. And because he did, a single morning in May of 1980 continues teaching the world lessons about science, courage, responsibility, and the extraordinary power of preserving the truth. There are countless stories in history that end the moment a person takes their final breath. Robert Landsberg's story did not. In many ways, it began there. His camera eventually fell silent. The mountain eventually became quiet again. The ash settled. The forest slowly returned. Entire generations grew up without witnessing the eruption that shocked the world on May 18th, 1980. And yet, because one man refused to let those final moments disappear, the story continues. Every scientist who studies Mount St. Helens, every student who learns how volcanoes can reshape the earth, every photographer inspired to preserve reality with honesty, every visitor who stands before that mountain and wonders what happened there over 4 decades ago is connected in some small way to Robert Landsberg. He never sought recognition. He never imagined becoming part of history. He simply believed that truth deserved to survive. Perhaps that is why his legacy feels so powerful today. It reminds us that greatness is not always loud. Sometimes it is found in quiet decisions, in moments when no one is watching, in choosing responsibility over fear, purpose over panic, legacy over recognition. The world often celebrates people who change history with power, but history also belongs to those who preserved it. Without them, we would never truly know what happened. Robert could not stop the eruption. He could not save the mountain. He could not save himself. But he accomplished something remarkable. He made sure the truth survived. And because of that, more than 40 years later, We can still stand beside him. We can still look through his lens. We can still witness those final moments exactly as he saw them. Few people ever leave behind a gift that continues helping strangers decades after they are gone. Robert Landsberg did, not with speeches, not with fame, not with fortune, but with a single roll of film, protected by the last act of an ordinary man who quietly became extraordinary. Perhaps that is the true lesson of this story. We may never know which ordinary day will become the most important day of our lives. We may never know which small decision will outlive us. But every single one of us has the opportunity to leave behind something meaningful. A truth, a kindness, a lesson, a memory, something that makes the world understand a little more than it did before. Robert Landsberg left behind photographs, but what he really preserved was a reminder that courage is not measured by surviving. Sometimes it is measured by what we choose to protect when everything else is about to be lost. Thank you for watching. If stories like this remind you that history is filled with extraordinary people whose names deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we uncover forgotten true stories, remarkable lives, and incredible moments that shaped our world, but somehow slipped through the pages of history. Until next time, keep remembering the people history almost forgot.